we're beginning what we'll be doing for the rest of the summer tonight, a series of reflections called Spectrum. It's not on. Works better. Coloring the parables with our own experiences. Hopefully this makes sense in light of the Pete Rollins video that we just showed. And this will make even more sense by the end of our chat tonight. I'm going to bring Ian up in just a minute to give us a little background and actually share a little bit about this artwork. And what we want to do tonight is really just introduce very broadly what a parable is and is not, but it's important to note that we cannot do this exclusively or exhaustively. It's more like we're going to sort of take a stab at things parables are or can be, or some of the how. How do parables function? Because parables themselves are enigmatic. And then beyond that, even the nature of parables is obscure and elusive. It's sort of hard to nail down what it is and why. So if it feels, as we're talking about this, like you're sort of grabbing at a rope of sand, like we're not talking about them, but we're talking sort of at them or around them, that's because we are. So you're not crazy. And then next week, we're actually going to address a bit of the why of parables, especially as we shift into looking at the parables of Jesus, why he teaches in that way, why he tells these stories, which is also sort of deeply mysterious and also a bit disturbing. But the heart of what we want to do with parables this summer is emphasize the way that they come alive and interact with us now, today, as we bring ourselves to them. And so the coloring sheets in the coming weeks are actually going to serve as a sort of metaphor for the way that we bring color to an otherwise black and white page. We will bring life and dimension to otherwise sort of flat renderings, stories. Part of the way we'll make this clear is by spending a bit of time each week understanding the context of the parables, because we'll learn tonight the context matters greatly. So Ian's going to come in a second and give us a bit of background on the David, this character we heard about in tonight's text. And we might summarize the background. He's going to give us a little, maybe kindly, the way that it appears in like the Leonard Cohen song that we're going to sing during the Eucharist. His faith was strong, but he needed proof. He saw her bathing on the roof, but her beauty in the moonlight overthrew you. It's a very kind way of putting it, but there are actually more salacious details that Cohen manages to leave out. So Ian's going to give us a bit on the background and then also on this artwork. And then we're just going to kind of throw back and forth from here.
All right, so I've heard a few responses from different people throughout the week about this artwork in particular, and I actually don't have any notes on this, so we're going to go off the cuff for a minute. And every week you'll see this spectrum graphic, but it'll have a different artwork behind it, and we wanted to use different traditional paintings representing or maybe relating to something in the parables. And actually, I feel like Peter Rollins did a really good job, and we didn't even think about this when we showed that clip, but he talked about art in the way that art should be experienced, right? So we keep coming back to it, and we get different ideas from it each time. And we as well put in our own ideas every time we approach art. And so this one is a little disturbing, and we'll actually get into the disturbing nature of parables. And so for so many reasons, this actually works really well.
No, we meant to do this.
We meant to do all of this. And so each week I'll go ahead and talk a little bit about the artwork chosen. And for this week, as you heard in the parable, it talks about a sacrifice of a lamb. And I guess not so much like a voluntary sacrifice, but one where a lamb was taken, right? Taken for slaughter and preparation. But this image itself has also a lot of connections with Jesus and that language of like Lamb of God, sacrifice, as well as a kind of obedience and a devotion to Jesus. And it was this symbolic kind of idea of faith and devotion into that as loyalty to this kind of ideology. But again, that's only one interpretation, right? So you could come to it with a whole different idea, but we'll be offering a little bit of value, or at least ideas that have happened or come across these paintings in the past. So back to the parable of this week. As you heard from this reading, two specific people were mentioned, right? We have Nathan the prophet, and we have King David. And at this time in David's reign, he has grown to great power. The kingdom is doing pretty well, and they're in a time of war, which wouldn't really be that unusual, especially for a kingdom with a lot of power. So David had sent Joab with his officers and some of his army, to conquer the Ammonites in another land. But he stayed back in Jerusalem. And while he was walking around one day, he spots a beautiful woman named Bathsheba. Maybe you've heard of her. He sees her, and in all his kingly desire, decides that she needs to be brought to him. One thing leads to another, and she becomes pregnant. But it's never really that straightforward, right? She's married, and her husband, Uriah, is fighting in the war against the Ammonites for David. So David goes through a series of attempts to try and convince her, or convince Uriah, that he needs to go home and spend some quality time with Bathsheba. But out of respect and as part of custom during wartime, the soldiers would not lay with their wives during this time. So he didn't do that. He didn't fall for that. So eventually David comes up with a plan where Uriah is going to be put on the front lines, and then the rest of the soldiers would be told to pull back. And then he would be killed, and David would not have to worry about breaking the news. So that's exactly what ends up happening. And only thing that David could do after that is let Bathsheba mourn and then take her as a wife. So now, knowing that context, we're going to hear this passage one more time. Then the Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said to him, "There were 2 men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought. He brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his meager fare and drink from his cup and lie in his bosom. And it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was loath to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the wayfarer who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared that for the guest who had come to him. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. He said to Nathan, 'As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing, because he had no pity.' Nathan said to David, 'You are the man.' Atah ha'ish, you are the man." It's a simple phrase, and you can feel the burn. David feels it. He's cut to the heart. Nathan doesn't come and directly address him like, "David, what did you do? Did you cheat with your friend's wife? Did you murder him?" No. All he does is tell a story. And this is what a parable can do. And this is one of the first parables in the Bible, and it's the only one from the Hebrew Bible that we'll do this summer. We'll be focusing more on Jesus' parables in the coming weeks. And this sets us up, though, for a really good example, right? A kind of extreme example, especially now knowing the context, of what parables can be and what parables can do. So what do we hear different in this parable as a result of some context, when we know some of the backstory behind it? How does David's engagement with the parable change as he begins to read himself through the parable and see himself as a character? He begins to encounter the parable as a vehicle into his own darkness and self-reflection, rather than a little simple moral tale.
What we're hoping, and sort of part of what we're doing tonight, is based on the idea that, again, sort of this extreme example, almost hyperbolic, but we think what works for David and the sort of Nathan and David exchange can work for us. And so our deepest hope about the value of the parables this summer is that every week and every parable and every character or element or action or every question that's brought up from the parables would eventually pass through what we might call the prophetic mirror. This is Nathan helping David to see himself, so that we won't let these stories remain black and white, but we will begin to color them in with our own lives. They won't remain sort of at a safe arm's length where we can academically evaluate them, or we can think that they're referencing someone else's life, but instead that we continue every time we hear and experience a parable to hear this declaration: you are this person, which is sort of a strong and almost offensive sort of declaration, but it begs the question, what does this parable mean in your life, right? Not just what does it mean, like we can hold this meaning apart from us, but what does it mean in your life, in your world, in your context? This is sort of a profound invitation for us to locate ourselves within a story within a parable, maybe in many ways, maybe we locate ourselves in the role of many different characters, as a vehicle for self-reflection. And I think often as a vehicle for self-critique. And it's not hyper-specific, right? The question after we read this parable should not be, have I or haven't I killed my friends? Or like impregnated their wives. No. Maybe we might ask the question, have I been disloyal? How have I compromised my integrity? How have I tried to cover that up with even more self-destructive behavior? So yeah, we aren't David, but the story invites us into our own darkness. And we'll even see in some of the more abstract parables that are less personal, we'll be forced to confront and consider our own views and our own values and the way that we see the world and the way that we understand reality. It's not about understanding a story apart from us, getting the answer right. Rather, it's about asking, what does this story do to us? What does this story do in us? And so the only way for a parable to work is for us to color them in with our own experience. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. But let's start sort of with the basics. What is a parable? Again, keep in mind, we're not really talking directly about them. We're trying to talk at them or sort of talk around them. More specifically, we're talking next to them. Para, this is the root word for parable. Para is alongside, and baro, to cast. So if we were going to translate it literally, it means to cast alongside. And you see this is how it's used. To cast a story beside someone or beside something. And Nathan is this extreme example. Here, Nathan puts a story beside David's life. Jesus tends to place stories besides more sort of already obscure and abstract ideas like the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God or who is my neighbor, things like that. Either way, it's placing a story beside someone or beside something in order to communicate a truth indirectly. Indirectly. It's saying something, it's revealing something, but it's not head on. Instead, it's sort of off to the side. It's not a shout, it's more like a whisper. It's not a command. Instead, the parable sort of haunts you. The more you sit with it, the more it goes to work on you, it sort of haunts you. And so parables require not only interpretation, trying to get what it means, but instead engagement, encountering what it does. And usually it's not a simple, direct message for people to hear. Instead, often as it sits beside us, it does its work, and it often contains a sort of obscure and enigmatic message that we experience, more so than we hear. Biblical scholar John Dominic Crossan says, it's a metaphorical story, always pointing externally beyond itself. Whatever its actual content is, a parable is never about that content. So in this example, Nathan's parable is not about a poor man and a lamb. It's not. There is no argument in which we could say this is literally about a poor man and a lamb. It's clearly about David, right? About his injustice. So a parable, often we could say it tells a disturbing truth. It reveals our values. It's often an unresolved provocation. I was thinking about it this week, and I thought, for me, the parables that are most disturbing to me, they sort of feel like someone who comes and stands too close to you, and you can only endure the discomfort for so long before you go, what? And they go, nothing. But you know there's something, right? There's a reason they're standing that close beside you. You know they see something that you don't see, or they know something that you don't know, and it feels like they're sort of holding it over you, gazing through you. So what parables are. But it's not just what about what they are, it's about what they aren't. That was really hard to say. Ian, what aren't parables?
So a rather simple start to this is a parable is not a tight narrative or story with a simple message, a simple moral, or single answer, right? And we've already heard this from Pete and a little bit from Ben as well. Peter Rollins says, it does not give us information about the world, but transforms the way we interact with the world. And as Crossan says, right, it's a metaphorical story. And parables are stories that have to be understood with limitations. And I think that we have to understand these limitations of a parable like the limitations of a metaphor. So here's an example. Her smile is the sun, right? So her smile is bright. Her smile is warm. It's inviting. Makes you feel good. But her smile is not a ball of fire that could kill us if it all burnt out, right? I mean, that's just not what that metaphor is saying. And we can't add these details that don't exist in the telling of a parable. We can't extend the ideas of a parable past what it offers us. And we have to be aware of this context in order to interpret it in the best way for ourselves.
So the focus then for us, if we're sort of using the coloring as a metaphor, is not the lines of the story, sort of the sheet that we're handed when we come in, but it's the way that we color it in. It's not the story that's cast beside us, but it's what happens when we engage the story that's cast beside us. Which brings us to fishing. This may be the first time I've ever used fishing as a metaphor in all of the history of my life as a clergy person. But it makes sense, right? Telling a parable is a bit like fishing, from what I understand. I'm not a great fisherman. But you cast a story, you throw it out there, beside someone's life. Maybe it bobs a little bit, maybe you reel it in a little bit. It does what it does, and you sort of wait and see what happens. The point is the bait draws the fish out. Now the bait or the story really is pretty much meaningless unless it's engaged. Like a bobber, if it just kind of floats there, just sits there. But the second we take the bait, that's when it's on. When we bite, when we bring ourselves to the parable, when we begin to color it in, when we see ourselves in it, when we begin to fill the story with our life and our meaning, it gets hooks in us. It calls us out and confronts us, and we can't seem to get away from it. It's one of those things like once you've seen something, you can't unsee it. So parables, they're not just these like convenient little moral lessons or cute little kids stories. They draw us out from where, many, many times from where we're hiding. And they reel us in. They pull us into themselves. And so Ian's going to show us sort of how this works using the story from tonight.
Okay, so back to tonight's parable with Nathan. It's a perfect example, really. So if we pay attention to how Nathan baits David, he tells a story of a rich man and a poor man, and the rich man has a visitor coming into town. Rich man, who is said to have a flock of animals, probably more, wants to prepare a meal for the visitor. So he takes the one young lamb that the poor man owns and prepares it for his guest. And he's baiting David, right? He's baiting him into one of the best biblical burns. David gets angry at the rich man, says he ought to die and pay back what he owes, plus more. And Nathan turns it around with a simple phrase, "You are the man," right? And we've already heard, David feels the burn, he's called out, right? And Nathan is very clever in how he sets up this story, right? How he casts the line. Like a skilled fisherman, he takes a simple story structure, a rich man and a poor man. And like Ben said, it's a black and white structure. It's binary, opposing characters. There's no names, no cultural affiliation, nothing. He brings in a third element, the ewe lamb. And going back in David's pre-Goliath and pre-kingdom past, right, he was a young shepherd boy. It's like Nathan is baiting David specifically right here, connecting to his past. Then the rich man comes, takes the poor man's only possession, and prepares it for an incoming guest. Not only that, but the rich man, like we said, probably has flocks of sheep and lamb to serve, which is in direct reference to David's current status, right, of wealth and power. And this movement in Nathan's parable would reflect perfectly the movement in David's life, from noble young shepherd to powerful, violent, and, as we saw in this story, an unjust king. And David doesn't see it right away, but as objective readers and placed right next to this Bathsheba story, we can see his name colored into this parable. And I think the importance of this parable and why we wanted to share this parable tonight is to emphasize this context. And this doesn't mean that context is always the way or the perfect tool in understanding all parables, but it's certainly a tool. And what you'll probably see, especially starting next week, is that there's no single way to understand this genre. And that's sort of the point. That's what we're getting at tonight. This is why the subtitle for this series is Coloring Parables with Our Own Experiences, right? Because we're baited. We're baited by our own ideas and experiences to engage with these parables, each in our own way. One reason we began with this parable is to show how an example of a parable functions in relation to someone's specific story, no matter how extreme it might be, especially in David's case. But David creates this problem for himself because of his desire, and then we see how the parable from Nathan is interpreted through that lens, placed right next to one another. And this might be extremely specific, but it's a great way and a great example to start with, right? In one way or another, this is what we'll be exploring through the rest of these parables. And the difference between this parable and kind of like what Ben was hinting at earlier is there's a difference between this one and like the parables of Jesus, is that a majority of Jesus's don't come with a necessary context placed right next to it. It's not conveniently there for us to look at and interpret it through that lens. And this kind of shows what Jesus is doing, right? We're baited. And this time it's not for David. It's for Jesus' audience, and it's us. So each Sunday for the rest of this series, we're going to be doing something a little bit different, something we've never done before. We've created a parable book for the collective kids next door, and each Sunday they will be reading the parable that we discussed the following week. So in this way, they'll be engaged with the same stories that we'll be addressing, and their voices and experiences will become part of our conversation. So we'll try and share some of their either drawings or writings in the room so that they can be also a voice that we get to hear every Sunday. And hopefully with their perspective, we'll have a few new thoughts. And even more hopefully, it will go a little bit like this.
Reach out, sense your surroundings. Use your feelings, you must. Younglings, a visitor we have.
Hello. I'm sorry to disturb you, Master.
What help can I be, Obi-Wan?
I'm looking for a planet described to me by an old friend. I trust him, but the systems don't show in the archive maps.
Lost a planet, Master Obi-Wan has. How embarrassing. How embarrassing. Liam, the Shades. Gather round the map reader, clear your minds, and find Obi-Wan's wayward planet we will.
It ought to be here, but it isn't. Gravity is pulling all the stars in the area towards this spot.
Gravity's silhouette remains, but the star and all the planets disappeared they have. How can this be? A thought? Anyone?
Master? Because someone erased it from the archive memory.
Truly wonderful the mind of a child is.
So if it's not totally clear on how that relates, probably in this case, a little bit of context would have helped as well. But just assuming that everyone has seen Star Wars, probably not a safe assumption, but you should probably just go watch it tonight. This is from Star Wars Episode 2, by the way. You can watch all 6, it's fine. And 7, sorry.
Wow, the nerd force is
Sorry.
strong.
Start with the first 6, and then you can go into 7, I guess. So with all the advancements in technology and our sophistications in society today, we as adults often overlook some of the more obvious answers to solutions. And the one's probably staring us right in the face, right? And this is kind of the setting or the scene for this, right? He comes with a question, can't find a planet, and the kids come with the obvious answer. Like, of course, it's just erased from the memory. And he's like, oh, I never would have thought about that. And so we're hoping that with these added voices in the room, we'll get some ideas that we would have never thought about, right? And what we're getting at with all of this that we've shown you tonight is that these parables require interpretation. And yes, context is important, but more important is your willingness to engage with these parables with your own self, with your own experiences, with your own ideas. And that's where the true value is found.
We're going to close with a story, kind of lead us into the Eucharist. I'll call it a parable, I guess. It just happens to be true. This is a parable that was told by Chris Murphy as the closing story of his 14-hour filibuster on the floor of the Senate the week after the Pulse shooting. Some of you may be familiar with this. He told this excruciating story about one of the children who was gunned down at Sandy Hook named Dylan. Dylan was a child on the autism spectrum. He had his special needs teacher with him that day at Sandy Hook, and his parents later recalled that he was in love with this teacher. She was his world. And she was one of these extraordinary teachers who's able to connect deeply with these kids, and especially for kids who are on the autism spectrum, this is very difficult. So this was an extraordinary relationship. So Chris Murphy, as a representative, only hours after the shooting, went to the firehouse to wait with the parents as they waited for news on their kids. And he was there with Dylan's mother when she learned that her child was not coming home. So of course, one of her immediate thoughts was, I need to find this teacher so that I can ask, what was he saying, what was he doing in these last moments. But she realized very quickly, this teacher is not coming home either, because she never would have left her child to die alone. And Chris Murphy says they learned in the following hours that what actually happened is that this teacher ran toward Dylan as the gunman entered the room and wrapped her body around him, covered him. And they died together in that way. And this is how they were found. Her body wrapped around this child, Chris Murphy says, so that his last emotion was not terror but love. This is a powerful story on its own. Conveniently, it comes with a little moral lesson. Protect the innocent, protect the least of these, stand between them and harm. This is at the heart of the Judeo-Christian faith. Save a life even at the cost of your own, even if you have to break the Torah. But how much more powerful with our current context? Not just that the story is true, but that Senator Chris Murphy told this parable during a filibuster on the heels of 4 years with no significant gun control or gun reform since Sandy Hook, and only days after Pulse, another mass shooting, the worst in U.S. history, where again, even more innocent young lives were taken. And with what seems to be a prophetic mirror, he says to the House floor, it doesn't take an act of courage to stand up here and filibuster for 14 hours. It takes an act of courage to run toward the gunman, to wrap your body around a child so that he doesn't die with fear in his heart, but with love. We know something must change, and we lack only the political will to do so. Essentially, he says that if we as lawmakers don't do something, if we lack this political will to run towards this child, and even legislatively, as best we can, to wrap ourselves around him, to protect him, then we are this man. We might as well have pulled the trigger. We might as well have carried the assault weapon into the club in Orlando. And it's not only the political suits on C-SPAN, because the truth is everyone in this room, we as citizens have the power to change laws. We lack only the political will to do so. The courage to demand the conversations, to demand gun control reform. And listen, I'm not saying, I know it's the 4th of July weekend, so this is dangerous. I'm not saying all guns, I'm not saying every gun. I don't think we're even in the realm of possibility. It's America weekend, it's Second Amendment weekend and barbecue weekend. And the truth is we have beautiful, responsible people, even in a lily liberal church like Collective, who own and responsibly store and enjoy and carry and collect and target practice and all this with firearms. That's fine. It's the 4th of July. It's our freedom. It's our right. But controlling this right responsibly is a part of what comes with freedom. And if we can't somehow admit that there's a way to keep the Second Amendment, but also to tighten control and restrictions on assault weapons, and for us to reduce the occurrences of mass casualty incidents, then unfortunately we have to hear from Nathan also, to look in this prophetic mirror, because then we are this man. We are somehow complicit. In Sandy Hook and Orlando and the next time, and the time after that. Are you beginning to understand the offensive and disturbing nature of parables? The way they live in context but transcend the context. The way they invite us in only to sort of put some hooks in us and demand that we look at ourselves, that we do some uncomfortable work. Eucharistic self-giving love is the kind that continues to run toward violence to insulate the innocent, to run into the face of violence, to wrap itself around the innocent, to to run defiantly but non-violently. Body to be broken, and blood to be shed. To name the injustice of the terrible and the powerful and the abusive individuals and the systems, but to name the probability that some of that darkness lives in us as well. So we're invited again to offer ourselves, our lives, to be wrapped around the innocent, beautiful, true, and good, broken and poured out to make mankind the kind of peaceful world imagined in the name of God. This table of subversive and destabilizing, radical self-giving love has been set for us tonight. It is open to us and all people, and no one will ever be turned away.